Welcome back. So for this lecture, we're going to continue talking about the linguistic history of Old English by focusing on syntax. And one notice is that compared to phonology and morphology, which we'll see in the next couple of lectures, there's less depth of discussion for syntax in Old English, and there's a couple of reasons for this. One of them is that it's kind of hard to gather true syntactic data from this time period because a lot of our texts are available through translation from Greek or Latin, and so this distorts some of the true nature of the natural syntax at the time, because oftentimes in translation you'll notice that it tends to take on some of the syntax of the language that you're translating from, as opposed to putting it into a true free-form translation in the syntax that you might expect people to be using in everyday speech. Also, most of our examples, especially from early in the Old English time period, are examples from poetry, which are also not really as reliable for syntax because there's a lot more freedom in poetic texts than what you would find in natural discourse. So things that you might expect to find sort of naturally occurring in everyday speech are very different in poetry, and we still see poetic license and how we see differences in the way that syntax is done poetically than what you would expect to see in how people are speaking in everyday language. Some of the changes and some of the distinctions in syntax during the Old English time period, however, was that they did have a relatively free word order compared to what we see in present-day English. There were more options of where to put words in a sentence because it was such a highly inflected language. We had things like case markers that gave us the relationship between words in a sentence, so you had a little bit more freedom of where you were going to put things. There were still some favored and sort of more default constructions, however. So within clauses, the most common were subject, object, and verb, and subject, verb, and object. But there were some others that were also relatively common. And so in present-day English, subject, verb, object would be the one that we would see most frequently. In Old English, it was actually more common to see subject, object, and verb, so to have verb final clauses than verb medial ones. This had switched by Middle English, and this sort of change into subject, verb, object has continued today and gotten even more rigid as we've lost morphology over time. So if we look at some of the ordering frequency from different examples of both Old English and Middle English, it can give you an idea of how those changes took place. So we can see that there are different kinds of constructions, all these different possibilities that you find, so you don't only see things like subject, object, verb, or subject, verb, object in these different writings that we have. We see a variety of them throughout, and we can expect that to continue in other forms of English as well, although the favored ones you can see sort of highlighted. So the subject, verb ones stays constant as a one that's favored, and this would be expected because the verb is coming after the subject in each of the SVO and SOV constructions. So if there is no object, you would just generally expect the subject to come before the verb in that case. But if you look at the first two columns, you'll notice that subject, object, verb and object, verb constructions are the next most frequent, and they're significantly more frequent than the ones that we see from the middle period, where during that period you notice that subject, verb, object takes over as the most common, or verb object with the object after the verb taking over as most common if there isn't a subject listed. So you'll notice that sort of shift, even though you see variation throughout all of these periods, that there is a preference for subject, object, verb constructions in Old English, and that switches by the 1100s and into the Middle English period, where you see a preference instead for subject than verb than object. Some of the other common patterns that we see in this time period, so if the verb were in second position in the sentence, something like an object or an adverb often preceded the verb sort of to topicalize it. So in a sentence, then in the morning the retainers heard that. The literal translation is the in morning heard that, and so you can see in the morning sort of in front of that. This is something we do still see in present-day English occasionally. Some sentences that begin with a particle were followed by a verb, and then offered he instead of and then he offered, which would be how we would put that today. So the verb would be coming in before the pronoun subject in those cases. In things like subordinate clauses, which we didn't really see very frequently in Old English, the verb was typically at the very end in that last position. So this is where something like subject, object, verb would become very visible. So the phrase, if they grabbed him the kingdom, literally is if they him that kingdom grabbed. So all of the other information, the subjects and the objects, are all in front, and then the verb is at the very end. And then in some cases, we would see the verb in final position in independent clauses, typically more frequently in narratives, so if it's embedded in a narrative. So, and then he went to the door and then valiantly defended himself would be, and then he to the door went and then valiantly himself defended. So you can see the verb moving to the end in this sort of story pattern that's being seen here. Some other things that start happening in Germanic languages early on that we see continuing and becoming more prominent through Old English and continuing in other areas as well is the use of periphrastic verbs. And so the idea that we're using a phrase for a verb rather than just an individual word. So Germanic captures some of the distinctions found in other languages, but they lost a lot of distinctions, as we saw previously, in many tenses and aspects, to where the only major inflectional distinctions is just between present tense and past tense. So things like future is only expressed with syntax. We use additional particles, additional words to convey things like future. The Old English did use subjunctive much more than what we see in present day English, so we don't really see the use of subjunctive. So if I were you instead of if I was you, for instance. And the inflection gave way to more phrasal constructions in present-day English. Old English did still inflect for infinitive, so this would be using a morpheme to mark the infinitive, as opposed to what we do now for something like to talk. They would have had a morpheme at the end of the root to sort of signify that infinitive, something closer to what you see in something like present-day Spanish. And then do is starting to be used as a proverb, sort of replacing a verb phrase if repeated, but we don't see this in the formation of negatives yet. So the negative markers are things that are very different, and negation can get very tricky, so we won't spend a lot of time really diving into negation in our examples. Within phrases, in noun phrases, the modifiers in Old English tend to stay very near to their nouns. Single adjectives were typically preceding the nouns, so those ignorant priests, you would have ignorant in front of priests, mighty lord, same kind of thing. But you were allowed different word orders in especially poetry, so King Alfred, you would often find Alfred König instead, so you'd have the king part after the name. And then we would see more flexibility with adverbial modifiers than with adjectives, so they did still tend to precede during this time. The negative marker was always preceding the verb it was negating. And this is something that still remains relatively flexible in present-day English, more than other word classes, although we are more likely to, by default, put an adverb after the verb now than what we would have seen in Old English. We can still move adverbs around pretty easily in English as a sort of unique aspect of syntax flexibility. Prepositions also generally preceded their object, something that we still do generally today, though not always. So in casual speech, you would be more likely to say something like, who are you going with, as opposed to with whom are you going, which the latter sounds a little bit more formal. So sometimes we do put prepositions at the end in casual speech. But we're sort of trained prescriptively to keep the prepositions at the front. And that was what we typically saw in Old English as well. So as I mentioned, there's not a lot in syntax that we can really dive into and look at because we don't have a lot of examples, we don't have a lot of details, besides things like poetry and things that are translated. But to summarize what we do know, it's thought that most Proto-Germanic languages had a neutral order as subject, object, verb, which is what we see at the beginnings of the English language until we start seeing a shift. And various factors shifted most of these Germanic languages from subject, object, verb into eventually becoming subject, verb, object. So we see this in other Germanic languages besides English as well. In English, there's also a very large increase in use of auxiliary verbs and the ability to move verbs into different places for things like emphasis. So if we do move the verb, it's usually because we're doing something very specific with that and not in a sort of default kind of way. A lot of scholars have suggested that this change in our word order from subject, object, verb into subject, verb, object helped lead to the breakdown of our case marking system and our other kinds of inflections that we saw. And it sort of reduced the flexibility of where we put things in a sentence as we lose that inflectional morphology. As the morphology becomes less distinct, as it becomes less useful, syntax has to sort of pick up the pace and hold the relationships more rigidly in the order that you're putting things in. And English and Germanic languages actually have a lot in common with other subject-object-verb languages, such as, for example, putting our adjectives in front of our nouns. So in a noun phrase, we would put our adjectives before our head noun in English, and other Germanic languages feature this as well. And this is usually reversed in typical subject-verb-object languages like Spanish and French, where the adjectives would come after the noun in those languages. So we would expect to find that in a traditionally subject-verb-object language, but some of the ways that we order our phrases in things like noun phrases with the adjectives before actually give us evidence of that sort of more historical subject-object-verb positioning that we had. So that's all for syntax. If you have questions, send me an email, schedule some office hours, bring questions to class, and we will talk through them together.